thank you, everyone. Thank you, Keith, for letting me have a few minutes to speak. Yeah, start the timer. Wait for it. So I'm here to talk to you about a crazy idea I had about 7 years ago, and an employer that will actually let me do something about it. So open intent is the idea that I had as a way to solve a problem. And the idea is to do it as a community-driven open source project. And that is to take the data that we spend hours and hours putting into our RF design tools and being able to use it moving forward, whether that's like implementation or automation. I'm not talking about an API, I'm talking about a schema, so that no matter what tool you use or what vendor you're going to take that design and put it into, that we have a way to interoperate between those two systems. And so it gives us a couple things. It gives us design tool optionality. How many of you have ever run into a situation where you have a stadium and the current tool you use that you've built your processes around isn't the right tool? I know I've been there, and then it's like, oh, well, I guess I'll figure something else out. It also gives us a starting place for automation. So I know automation is a big, scary word. For those of you who took my Python class this weekend, you know how painful it can be. But this gives us a starting place where we have a common type of data that we can all access in the same way, and that's a good place to start building your automation from. It also gives us programmatic interface between vendors. So how many of you have ever had a interaction where you tried to upload a project to an NMS and it's like, oh, sorry, you saved this in the wrong version of that file, try again when you upgrade. The idea here is that we have a version schema that we can interact between them without having direct, tightly coupled integrations. And then finally, unfortunately, the state of things is I only know of one major RF design tool that has an API. And I know that that's a really scary thing for a lot of them. And this gives you a kind of simplified way to say, well, we can provide this data and at least get people started. And instead of trying to build it all at once, we can build it in a small piece. So why do this? Well, getting from RF design to implementation has always been a challenging step. Most of us do a couple things. One, we do nothing. We don't put the maps in, we just put the APs on whatever system and let RM or ARM do its magic and hope for the best. Many of us have spent years also putting those maps in those NMSs trying to do it by hand. Or we rely on a vendor-specific implementation and hope that both vendors that we're using support the same things. Or you can automate, and historically, and 7 years ago when I came up with this, I did the thing that did that last one. I used the vendor's proprietary format to do all of this wonderful automation, and it was great. And the next year when I went to do it again, the schema changed. So, and then I had to do it all over again. And that's the effort we don't want to spend time doing. So where does open intent live? It lives between our RF design tools and the vendors, but it also lives between other things. If you ever want to do location, blue dot and location services, you need a map. You need to be able to visualize where your APs are for things like 11MC. And so this gives us a way to leverage the work we put in on RF design for other stuff down the road. A couple things about open intent. It is semantically versioned. So you say, I did this design in open intent version 1, and the other end knows oh, version 1, I'll go pull those models and use that to import the data. So you don't have to be tightly coupled playing the version game, right? It also supports vendor proprietary extensions. And what does that mean? It means if one of the RF tooling vendors or even an AP vendor wants to provide a piece of data that's not in the schema, we have a mechanism for them to do that. So options for RF tooling companies to differentiate what they give you and what you can do with it. And then the other piece I'm interested in is I can also take feedback from things like telemetry and put it back into my RF design and see what changed. Oh, I designed this with 20 meg channels and every channel possible, and you left it at the vendor defaults, which was no DFS and 80 meg channels. I wonder why it didn't work. So currently the use cases are visualization of intent, where the APs, like what channel, power, et cetera, are they on? Things that you need specifically to visualize, like placement in a building. And the next one is deployment automation. How do I configure my APs in whatever system I use, like programmatically from that data? So where's the model? Jake, show it to us. There isn't one. Right now, it doesn't exist. We're announcing this here today to get you guys involved in coming up with what that model needs to include. I could definitely, and I may have one, where I've said, these are all the things I want in the model. And if I just wrote that down and went to all the vendors and said, please do this for me, it wouldn't happen. Because I've been doing that for the last 7 years. It hasn't happened. Obviously, it's not a Jake thing. It needs to be an us thing. So starting the week of February 20th, we are going to be holding 2 community meetings every other week. One for EMEA-friendly time slots on, I think it's Wednesday the 22nd, and one for APAC-friendly time slots on the 23rd. And we're going to run those every other week, twice a week, every other week for the foreseeable future. Our goal is to have something that's a draft of the model sometime before the first half of the year, and basically give some time for the tooling vendors and AP vendors to look at it and start planning for how they're going to integrate with it. So what can you do to help? There's nothing behind me, so there is a Google group mailing list where I'm posting the information about the upcoming meetings, as well as meeting notes. But really, we want you to come to the meetings and bring your requirements. Francois just showed some really awesome stuff around his survey data, around, this is more focused on design, but bring those ideas to the table, because if you don't, we won't build the things you need to make it happen. 2 is to ask your vendors for a few things. Ask them to participate in these meetings. Unlike OpenConfig, vendors have a stake in this as well, right? They have to do things that are real, and they have to do things that they can support. And so we want their input as well as the operators and partners and resellers in the room. So ask them to join the meetings with what their requirements and criteria are. Also, I know Ekahau and Hamina have both committed to having a feature in their feature upvote. Go vote. Say, hey, this is something I want to leverage. That helps them, lets them know that this is something they should be prioritizing in the roadmap. If you want to help write the model, great, come to the meetings. I'm fully planning on having to do most of the work myself for writing the model, but I am very open to help. There are contribution guidelines on the GitHub. And if you want to, tooling is another thing, lesson learned from OpenConfig, that we need tooling to also help you make it easier. So if you want to write tooling, you want to write models, the contribution guidelines are online. And if you want more details, you can check it out. It's github.com/google/openconfig. And with my 40 seconds left, there are some frequently asked questions. Is it part of OpenConfig? Nope, this is a separate effort. We are not pushing config to anything. Why is it at Google's GitHub? They're my employer, and all the other work to get it as a standalone project like OpenConfig was longer than what I would get approved to talk this week on. Is it a replacement for OpenConfig, Open Wi-Fi, et cetera? I'm not aware of a project that has this scope, and so no, it should interact and complement those other programs. What about non-Wi-Fi? Well, maybe if someone really wants to, but it's set up in a way we can. So that is OpenConfig, or Open Intent. Thank you for the time.